Hey everyone, I'm Vladimir Dutit. We are watching all the news happening in the United States and all around the world. If it is coming into the CBS News Broadcast Center from any of our stations or affiliates, we're going to bring it to you live right here. This is CBS News 24/7. Convention kickoff. Democrats are descending on Chicago for the party's national convention as new CBS polling gives us a look at the state of the presidential race right now. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is meeting with Israeli officials today and warns this may be the last opportunity for a hostage release and ceasefire deal in Gaza. We will have the very latest on the negotiations. And disgraced former congressman, that's George Santos, is expected to plead guilty to federal charges today. We'll take you live outside the courthouse. But we begin this morning with the Democratic National Convention set to get underway in Chicago. Vice President Kamala Harris will officially accept her party's nomination for the presidency of the United States. Vice President Harris is already in the Windy City, and before arriving, she and her running mate, that's Governor Tim Walz, campaign in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Tonight, we'll hear from President Biden and the First Lady, plus former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And later in the week, former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton will speak before Harris takes to the stage on Thursday. Joining me now from Chicago is CBS News campaign reporter Shauna Mizell. She's been following the campaign this entire time. So, Shauna, break down what we can expect from today's events up until the president speaks.
Vlad, good morning. It's great to be with you today. Today is day one of the DNC kicking off in Chicago. And right now there are a slew of events happening. They are state delegation breakfasts. And I just left the Wisconsin delegation breakfast where we saw Majority Leader Chuck Schumer come up and speak about how critical Wisconsin is going to be not only in the presidential election, but for Democrats to maintain the majority in the Senate. But there was also a surprise visit from Harris's running mate, Tim Walz. He talked about how it's been a very busy 11 days since Harris has selected him, and even highlighted some of the stops that they made yesterday on the campaign trail.
All right, Shauna. So the question, of course, is what kind of a speech are we expecting President Biden to deliver this evening? From what we understand, the moments leading up to the president taking to the stage is going to be a reflection, a look back, a memorialization of, as Democrats see it, the successes of the Biden administration. What are you hearing?
Well, we know that it was very contentious, and Biden really took a lot of time in deciding to step down. But since then, he has thrown his support behind Harris. He actually endorsed Harris about 30 minutes after he stepped down in a post on X. So he will definitely be highlighting his accomplishments. But people here are also very thankful for Biden. There was actually somebody just walking around in a shirt that said, "Thank you, Joe." We know that he vied for the presidency for a very long time and has really dedicated his life to service and politics.
All right, Shauna Mizell for us, reporting from the Windy City. Shauna, thank you very much. And don't forget, CBS News will have coverage of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago throughout the day, plus special programming beginning today at 5 p.m. Eastern. Meanwhile, a new CBS poll shows Vice President Harris has opened up a slim 3-point lead nationally over her Republican counterpart, former President Donald Trump. Our Elections and Survey Executive Director, Anthony Salvanto, has the very latest on that. All right, Anthony, love this time of year for you. Break down what we're seeing for the polls.
How you doing, Vlad? Let me show you those numbers because I want to put this in context for everybody. This is a tight race. This is a close race. That's your takeaway you need to know. Yeah, it's +3 nationally for Harris, but the fact is that while everyone's opinion counts in the nation, it's not the national popular vote that decides the presidency. It's the battleground states, the ones that happen to be closest. And that, our estimate is even. State by state, they're all close. That's what you need to know. So what does that mean going into the convention, Vlad? Let me show you this first and foremost. We got here, back to this even race, where Joe Biden had been trailing, because when Harris became the nominee, we saw a boost in enthusiasm among Democrats. More of them starting in July and heading into right up to now keep saying they're going to vote. What does that tell you? Tells you part of this convention is going to be Democrats trying to keep that enthusiasm going, keep that momentum going, because so much is going to depend on them staying even with Republicans on that turnout, that excitement metric, Vlad.
So, Anthony, let me ask you, one of the things that even Democrats, but especially Republicans, have been wondering is what kind of policies are we expected to learn from Kamala Harris? Because up until this moment, as you know, it's been sort of a honeymoon phase where the base is very, very excited. We got a little bit of a flavor of the kind of policies she might enact should she be elected president. But what are you hearing about that? What people want to hear about her vision for the future?
Well, as always, Vlad, you ask the key question, right? So we've got two, I think, dynamics here. One is, do people know what Kamala Harris stands for? And the fact is, this is not surprising, right? You've got a third of people who say that they don't. Well, there's a lot of space in there for that fight within the fight here to define her and for her to define herself for those folks who fall into that bucket, right? Number one. But number two, since tonight is this kind of passing of the torch from Biden to Harris, you want to look at how different or the same do people think that they are. Well, 2/3 of voters think her views and policies are going to be mostly the same, but not entirely the same as his. That's important because she, number one, she does better among voters when they think it's mostly, but not entirely. And number two, because remember, because Joe Biden was trailing, so you don't necessarily want to be seen as entirely the same. You want to talk about some of those differences. That's the balance that she's got to strike tonight, and that's how you sort of quantify it, Vlad.
Yeah, if I'm the Harris campaign, Anthony, I'm looking at those numbers and I like what I see because on one hand, and if you're President Biden, if you were worried, if you thought to yourself that if the president thought that he was the one that was going to beat Donald Trump, these numbers actually kind of don't tell that story. The way I read them is when people say she's entirely the same in terms of policies, that means that they think Joe Biden was a successful president and that Kamala Harris will continue with those policies that made him a successful president, right? And then when you look at that 19% that says entirely the same, the 19%, in my mind, it sort of says, okay, there will be some differences that she distinguishes herself, for example, perhaps with Middle East policy and what's going on between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah, because, and I think you break it down right, because there's always going to be a little bit of wish casting when there's a new candidate, right? You think, well, they give them a chance to stand for the things that I want them to stand for. So there's going to be some in that response. And then some of it's going to be pejorative. Some of it's going to be, oh, well, we'll just, dismiss. If you're a Republican, you go, well, she's probably the same as Joe Biden. Some of that is going to be baked in there, too. And that's going to be part of her messaging as well. The other part of this, Vlad, because it speaks to what you're saying, is we've seen this growing gender gap in the polling and more women now voting Harris, more men moving or voting for Trump. And the way it speaks to your point there is that women are starting to give Harris a little more benefit of the doubt on issues, especially on the economy, where when they think it's an important issue, they're a little better in voting for her than they were for Joe Biden. So to your point, it's a little bit of that, where can she be different from Joe Biden? Because certainly on the economy, he wasn't doing very well. So there's a sort of room to grow in there if her campaign works out there, Vlad.
Yeah, I mean, look, the national polling that you're suggesting here, showing that Vice President Harris is polling within the margin of error, or in some instances pulling ahead of former President Trump, essentially says to me, if you liked everything that Biden did, you just were not enthusiastic about his campaign because you had concerns about his age. So that's sort of how I read that. Now, meanwhile, you're showing the former president there. He polls well on some of the issues that Republicans care about, and even some Democrats, specifically immigration and the economy.
We just cannot forget, and so I'm glad you raise it, where Donald Trump does well and what has not changed in this campaign. And these are some of those things. The economy, I mentioned it, but he's still leading on it. Inflation specifically. And it's not just inflation. There's more people who think that if Trump becomes president, that prices will go down. Now, they're not, and they tell us, they're not specifically sure how that would happen, but there's a larger sense of, nostalgia for his economy when he was president that's baked into a lot of these numbers. And so you get that confidence going forward. Not only would he tackle inflation, but they would actually make prices go down. That's something that then you watch the convention, can Harris push back against that idea? Because he's definitely got an advantage on it. And it's been consistently the most, if not one of the most, important issues. And yeah, very quickly to mention on the border as well, people thinking that his policies would reduce border crossings. So all of those are advantages for Trump, who is polling, if you compare it to 2020, is polling better than he was polling in 2020. So a lot of that is about what hasn't changed here, Vlad.
Anthony Salvanto with the most interesting conversation I think I will have all day. Thank you, Anthony, as always, my brother. Appreciate you.
Thanks, buddy.
All right. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign has had a busy week. They're going to have an even busier week with stops in multiple states that will serve as counter-programming to the DNC this week. CBS News campaign reporter Jake Rosen joins me now for more on this. So, Jake, a lot of people have been hitting, and people in the Republican Party have been hitting the former president because he's been holding these sort of like nonchalant press conferences at Bedminster, at Mar-a-Lago. He's going on radio shows and calling into his favorite talk shows, but not really hitting the road. That changes this week. What's his strategy?
It absolutely does, Vlad. We saw former President Trump just up the road in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on Saturday, filling an arena of people. He is in York, Pennsylvania, just down the road from where I am in Harrisburg today, giving an economic message on those things that Anthony just mentioned he's doing so well on. His messaging on inflation and how he would get prices down and energy prices down if he wins office in November. He'll also be in Arizona later this week to give a message on immigration, and he'll do some kind of border tour. He's going to be in Michigan, where he'll give a law enforcement speech backing the blue up in Howell, Michigan. And he's also going to be rallying with J.D. Vance, his first rally outside since the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt just over a month ago on Wednesday. So we'll see, but former President Trump hitting the trail, and his campaign in their direct counter-programming to the DNC is having daily press conferences with surrogates in Chicago at Trump's property there.
Jake Rosen for us. Jake, as always, we appreciate you. Thanks. Okay, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, there you see him over my shoulder, is in Israel. He is pushing for a ceasefire deal and a hostage negotiation deal. Blinken met with Israeli President Isaac Herzog earlier. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also meeting with the Secretary of State in Tel Aviv this morning. And Secretary Blinken warned this may be the last opportunity to reach a deal. CBS News foreign correspondent Ramy Inocencio joins me now from the region. So, Ramy, Blinken says this is a decisive moment for negotiations. Where do talks currently stand? Could we see, I think people on both sides are collectively holding their breath that this potentially, hopefully, could be a breakthrough moment. Is that a possibility this week?
Well, it's a possibility, Vlad, but based on the statements that are coming out, it's a mixed bag over the past 24 hours. The most recent statement that we got was out of the office of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And the words that I'm looking at here in this three-sentence statement was positive and in good spirit. And also, they were saying that the Prime Minister reiterated Israel's commitment to the latest American proposal in order to get to this ceasefire, stressing Israel's security needs. But this statement is actually quite different from the statement we got yesterday when the Prime Minister spoke with his cabinet ministers and basically said that he was pessimistic about any deal, that there was not a high chance of any kind of deal. Not only that, the latest statement that we got from Hamas, which was also last night, which quickly followed Netanyahu's statement, was that they were saying that Netanyahu was sabotaging talks and that the proposal that is floating out there now really leans toward what Israel, what Netanyahu wants, and that's things like the rejection of a total ceasefire, rejection of a comprehensive withdrawal from Gaza, as well as the rejection of a pull away, the pull out from the border area between Gaza and Egypt. So there's a mixed bag here. Notably, though, while we've heard from the office of the Prime Minister, we still have not yet heard from the State Department, from what the U.S. messaging is. It's been about 3-4-ish hours since that happened, and we're still waiting for that to drop.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable, Ramy, because you've interviewed family members of Israelis who have hostages, loved ones family members that are still being held by Hamas. And of course, I'm sure for them, they are pressing the prime minister to figure out a way to bring those hostages home, by the same measure also bringing about a ceasefire, right? But it seems like we're getting further and further away, and I just sort of wonder if Netanyahu is even listening at this point to some of those family members.
You know, a good question. There are critics who will be saying that he lives in a bubble and he is only listening to his ministers. There are critics who might go even one level deeper and say he's only listening or taking into consideration his far-right ministers. Remember, his government is the most far-right in Israeli history. The idea here is that if he accedes to some kind of ceasefire, that theoretically then could topple his coalition, and he relies on his far-right ministers for that. And there are other people who are also criticizing, saying that if he loses power, then he could go to jail for crimes that have happened over the past few years. So there's this domino kind of effect that people are mapping out, and that is why many people are saying he does not want to get to any kind of ceasefire, and he wants to hold on to power purely for himself.
Ramy Inocencio with that breakdown for us. Ramy, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Here's hoping that there is a negotiation and that peace comes to the region. Thanks, Ramy. All right, parts of the Northeast are dealing with the aftermath of severe storms overnight. Flash flooding and mudslides forced families out of their Danbury, Connecticut homes. The Oxford fire chief confirms at least one person has died, and the search is still on to find one missing person. Floodwaters rushed along a little river. Fire officials say that there was one person in the car who's clinging to a sign when the floods took him down the road. Road conditions have also been dangerous for drivers in New Jersey. Manholes swelled with water pooling along the streets in Kearney. Let's toss it over to CBS News correspondent Nikki Batiste, who's getting a firsthand look at the damage in the daylight from Sandy Hook. So, Nikki, what are you seeing out there?
Vlad, I'm actually standing in the yard of a family. We'll show you their home in a second. This is what was their driveway. This is a local road. This really paints a picture of what's been going on in southern Connecticut in about the last 24 hours. So basically water, debris rushed down this road, and there's a drain right here which was basically overwhelmed, causing their driveway to just collapse. I was just talking with Kim, one of the homeowners here, who said she just all of a sudden at 3 p.m. saw water rushing into their house, about a couple inches on the first floor, about 5 feet inside. Their driveway collapsed. You can see pieces of metal of what was their driveway. It was about 2 feet above where it is now. But to really give you some context about how powerful this water was gushing into their house, she told me that their mailbox, which was over here, flew into the back of their car. I don't know if you can see it, Fred's panning over right here, and now is behind their house. So that mailbox flying all the way behind their house. Luckily, the family here is safe, she said, and as it was happening, I said, what were you feeling? She said, I thought our house was going to wash away. Thankfully, they're okay. You mentioned one person has died. One is still missing in Oxford, Connecticut, which is about 6 miles northeast of here. Also locally yesterday, a home for seniors had to be evacuated. Another report that there was a wedding going on with about 150 people that got stuck because of the floodwaters who were ultimately rescued. Vlad?
All right, Nikki Batiste reporting from the region. Nikki, thank you very much. Let us bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the first look at the national forecast. Grant.
I'll tell you, Vlad, just unbelievable amount of rainfall. You talk about the probability of something like that happening, and it's about a 0.1% chance that something like that happens in any given year. Let me show you some of these rainfall totals observed from around the area, from New York to Connecticut, and even northern New Jersey picked up a lot of rain. But Newtown, Connecticut saw 10 inches of rain. Unbelievable amount of rain. And this isn't over a month or a couple of months. That was all in an afternoon. Just crazy stuff. So some showers and storms across the Northeast. In fact, they're in for another round of more showers and storms. Some places could pick up between 3 to 4 inches of rain. So a slight risk of more flash flooding. The ground is just so saturated, it can't take any more rainfall. Meanwhile, nicer weather on the way across the Midwestern states down into the mid-Tennessee Valley. Very hot conditions across Texas. We'll talk about this. Dallas today looking at high temperatures around 106, and that heat wave does not stop anytime soon. Vlad, back over to you.
All right, Grant, thanks very much. We'll check in with you a little bit later. Yeah. Disgraced former Congressman George Santos plans to plead guilty today to multiple felony charges. Coming up, we're going to look at the severity of the charges and if Santos could face jail time. We'll be right back. We have some sad breaking news this morning. Legendary television talk show host Phil Donahue has died. His publicist just confirmed to CBS News. These pictures are just from this past May when Phil Donahue received the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the White House. He was known for his style of hosting, focusing on one guest or topic per show and involving the audience. It's not clear how he died, but for many, many people in this industry, the broadcasting industry, Phil Donahue remains an icon and a legend, and many, many, many people took their cues from him. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Okay, let's talk about George Santos, the disgraced Republican ex-congressman, expected to plead guilty in federal court today. He's looking at nearly 24 felony fraud charges. CBS News correspondent Scott MacFarlane is outside the federal courthouse in New York and joins me now to talk about it. So, Scott, for the audience who may not have been following this, just break down those charges against Santos.
Yeah, this is the latest chapter in the saga of George Santos, but this might be the climactic chapter. He faces nearly 24 federal criminal charges: fraud, money laundering, misuse of public funds. But the sources speaking with CBS News say he is poised to enter a guilty plea to some number of those 23 charges today, raising the prospect, if not the likelihood, he could serve prison time. George Santos' crimes, according to the Department of Justice, include ripping off his own campaign donors, stealing their identities and using it to make credit card charges, using campaign donations to put himself in the lap of luxury, to buy spa treatments, designer clothes, Botox treatments, and filing false campaign paperwork. Just some of the charges he faces. And Vlad, of course, that's on top of him fabricating his own life story, his biography, his family roots, his resume. One of the reasons why he was expelled from Congress in December.
You know, Scott, when you list those charges, it sounds outlandish. It's hard not to laugh, but these are real charges. They're very serious. And in this age where people are often grifting, the question, of course, becomes how likely is he to serve some time behind bars? Because anybody else reading this would be like, okay, this is kind of funny, except it's not funny because he was a sitting member of Congress.
It's a really important question, and it's a really tricky question. Federal felonies often lead to prison sentences, but in the federal system, they have sentencing guidelines, ranges presented to federal judges when they determine the proper sentence. And judges always warn defendants at plea agreement hearings in federal courts that they are not bound by those guidelines, and they are not yet determined what they're going to sentence somebody to when they accept a guilty plea. There was some negotiation over this plea for months, Vlad. They've been saying it in open court that they were on a trajectory towards a possible plea. It seemed to fall apart earlier this summer. Then all of a sudden, after a hearing last week, it came back and is likely at 3 p.m. Eastern time today. I'll issue this guidance, as is custom in the federal court system. They don't sentence at the plea agreement hearing. It'll likely be months until there's a sentencing hearing, which means it's likely going to come after Election Day, potentially not until 2025.
All right, Scott MacFarlane, following the story for us. Scott, we appreciate you. Thank you very much. So as the DNC gets underway in Chicago, several planned protests are also getting ready to begin. Tens of thousands are expected to protest the Israel-Hamas war just blocks from the convention site. We're going to take you there live. Next, you're streaming CBS News 24/7. Here's a look at some of the top stories we're following this morning. A powerful earthquake triggered a volcano to erupt in Russia. It happened along the country's far eastern coast over the weekend. The eruption spewed plumes of ash 3 miles up into the sky and triggered a code red warning for aircraft. But scientists warn tremors could cause another major eruption. More than 167,000 pounds of Purdue frozen chicken nuggets are being recalled after customers reported finding metal wire in those nuggets. In a statement, Purdue said upon inspection, it found a thin strand of metal wire was inadvertently introduced during the manufacturing process. And out of an abundance of caution, Purdue is recalling all potentially impacted packages. There is a new report out today from House Republicans accusing President Biden of corruption. The claims of abuse of power and obstruction of justice are tied to the financial dealings of his son, Hunter Biden. The impeachment inquiry report does not expressly state any criminal wrongdoing by the president. Instead, it accuses the Biden family of trading in on its brand and business ventures. There was no formal recommendation for the House to move forward with impeachment, though. The White House called the whole thing a, quote, stunt. Turning back to our top story, with day one of the Democratic National Convention kicking off in Chicago, Vice President Kamala Harris will officially accept her party's nomination for the presidency later this week. She arrived in the Windy City yesterday after campaigning in the key battleground state of Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, President Biden and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will take to the stage tonight, and later in the week, former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, along with former First Lady Michelle Obama, will speak before the vice president herself takes to the stage on Thursday. CBS News Minnesota reporter Caroline Cummings joins me now with the very latest on this. So, Caroline, the president is expected to give his keynote address tonight. What else do we know about what's planned for the convention?
Well, good morning, Vlad. So it is a long list of kind of top Democrats headlining this week at the convention, but Democratic officials are really kind of trying to weave a narrative throughout this week of the DNC. So their theme is for the people, for our future, and through each night when they have these different themes, they're going to try to draw a contrast between former President Donald Trump and his campaign and his vision for the future with the Harris-Walz ticket for the future. And the Democrats are trying to make the case that Donald Trump is trying to bring the country backwards and that he's trying to relitigate some of his grievances of the 2020 election, going to criticize his Project 2025 plan. And so they're really trying to draw that contrast, and that will begin tonight with President Biden's speech. And he's expected to highlight a lot of what the administration has done, of course, with Vice President Kamala Harris by his side as his number two, that has since taken the torch to usher this administration and this Democratic future into the next 4 years should she win the White House. So those are kind of what we're expecting. As far as speakers, you mentioned a lot of them, but we'll also hear from the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff. We'll hear from Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, and of course the Democratic nominee in 2016, and also former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a key Democrat in the party, and also the leaders of the House and Senate, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer over in the Senate, are also scheduled to speak. Vlad.
So, Caroline, we're showing a graphic here of all those people that you just mentioned. And what's sort of interesting and what struck me is that many of these speakers are, by all accounts and by the reporting that we've done and others, those folks who had a role to play in in President Biden stepping down and naming or endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris as his successor. But we can expect that this will be a kumbaya moment for the Democrats. We're not expecting any signs of disunity, even though, as I said, the reporting is that folks like former President Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi, basically reading the tea leaves, helped to pressure the president to step aside.
Right, and that's exactly right, according to all of our reporting and reporting elsewhere. That's exactly right. But now that he has stepped aside, there is this sense of unity. And think about how quickly the party coalesced around Vice President Harris in the immediate aftermath after he announced that he was dropping out of the race. He endorsed her, and it was a pretty clear runway there for all of the chips to fall in line, the virtual roll call vote of the delegates to make it official. Kamala Harris is the nominee even before they do the, kind of pomp and circumstance of the roll call here at the DNC. So, yes, they have kind of coalesced around here, and this is a chance for them to project to Americans that the party is unified and ready to move forward under a Harris-Walz administration. But
all right, Caroline Cummings reporting. Thank you, Caroline. Appreciate you. Meanwhile, the city of Chicago has been preparing for tens of thousands of protesters to participate in demonstrations near the DNC this week. We mentioned earlier how some of those protests have already started to happen, hoping to call attention to a variety of issues from women's reproductive rights to economic injustice and, of course, the Israel-Hamas war. CBS News correspondent Roxana Saberi is in Chicago near Union Park, where protests are set to begin later today. Roxana, what's the atmosphere like this morning?
Good morning, Vlad. Well, we've seen the crowds build here slowly with protesters coming in. They've been bringing in signs in support of Palestine, some Palestinian flags as well. Their main issue here today, their main message is to end the war in Gaza and to call for the end of U.S. support in Israel, among other causes which you mentioned. This protest is the main one that's supposed to take place this week at the DNC. It's organized by the Coalition to March on the DNC, which is a group of more than 200 different organizations. One of their spokespeople told us that they're expecting thousands of people to march here today. And over the course of this week, tens of thousands of people, he's hoping. Many of them bust in from other states. The march today will start from this park here in Chicago, Union Park, and go toward the United Center, which is that way, and that's where the delegates will be meeting in the evenings this week, and then they'll circle back here. Now, the organizers had hoped for a march route of 2.5 miles to accommodate the crowds that they're expecting. In the end, they were only allowed 1 mile, but they did get another concession yesterday. They said the city's mayor, Brandon Johnson, agreed to allow them to set up their own sound system and stage, which is what they are doing here in the park right now so that they can amplify their message. Vlad?
So, Roxana, as you well know, Tony DeCopel did a story on some of the historical antecedents to this convention, specifically 1968, where police clashed with protesters. What's the concern from police in 2024? Because the images that we saw back in 68, I'm pretty sure the city of Chicago does not want to see repeated again.
Exactly, and city authorities and state authorities say that they're pretty confident that's not going to happen here again. The police department here says that they've been training their forces in de-escalation techniques, that they've been preparing for this for months. Superintendent Larry Snelling has said that his forces will respect people's First Amendment rights, but that they will not tolerate vandalism or violence. Also, he has said that mass arrests are a possibility, but they will be a measure of last resort. The superintendent also said that they are expecting counter-protesters, but they're going to try to keep them as separate as possible from protesters. And the people organizing this protest here today said they plan to remain peaceful. So we'll see. Vlad?
And Roxana, we sort of gave a list of what protesters are mostly interested in getting a message out around, including women's rights, economic injustice, and of course what's happening in Israel, between Israel and Hamas. What are people telling you about why they feel this is the platform, this is the day, this is the time to do something like this?
Well, it's such a high-profile event, as you know, and they want to be within sight and sound of the delegates who will be meeting at the United Center. And the march that they're going to have here in a few hours is going to be right up against the border of the United Center. Some protesters say that now that Vice President Harris is going to be running as the presidential candidate for Democrats, there is a little less feeling of urgency to make this message known about the war in Gaza. But for the organizers here, they say it has made no difference for them. They still feel like this message needs to be heard, particularly by the Democrats, and that Vice President Harris represents the same policy toward Israel and Gaza as President Biden did, and that nothing's changed for them. Vlad?
All right, Roxana Saberi reporting from Chicago. Roxana, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Rivers of water. Look at these images coming into our newsroom. Rivers of water flooding a Connecticut town, forcing people out of their homes. This is video from Hermitage Village in Monroe. Emergency crews drove through those dangerous floodwaters to get people to safety, and at least one person tragically has died, while one person remains missing. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, the same storm system forced traffic to come to a standstill on some major highways. State police say people were rescued from their vehicles as their cars were towed. CBS News New York reporter Christina Fenn has more from Nutley, New Jersey.
Good morning. Flash flooding was the major concern across parts of northern Jersey yesterday. And to give you an idea of just how fast the water levels rose and then fell, this is the third river in Nutley, New Jersey behind us. And yesterday at around 8 p.m., the water crested. It was able to submerge the bridge in this park, leaving lots of debris behind. It was a similar scene all across New Jersey. In Belleville Sunday, the mayor and city officials had to post photos urging people to stay off the roads right writing that every department, from fire to police to public works, were out rescuing people from stalled out cars. Now, most of the water has since receded, and any service disruptions there were yesterday to public transportation, such as NJ Transit and Amtrak, those have since been resolved. Reporting from Nutley, New Jersey, Christina Fan, CBS News, New York.
All right, Christina, thank you. Let's bring back CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with another look at the national forecast. Grant.
Now, Vlad, I'll tell you what a helpless situation where that heavy rainfall just continues to come and the flooding just continues to get worse and worse and worse. Fortunately, the rain has tapered off in some places this morning, while more rain is expected later on this afternoon into the evening hours. So flash flooding is going to be another concern as we go into today. Good news, better weather on the way through the rest of the week. But just look at some of these rainfall totals. Newtown, Connecticut, 10 inches of rain just in an afternoon. Miller Place, New York, 9.84 inches of rain. Down towards Livingston, New Jersey, about 4.13 inches of rain. It's a lot of rainfall, and there's just nowhere for it to go except for up, and that's when you start getting those flash flooding situations. There are some scattered showers and storms across portions of eastern Connecticut, out towards Rhode Island and Massachusetts this morning. Meanwhile, some showers lingering just offshore. It's a low-pressure system that's sweeping across the northeast, and that will bring another round of potentially flash flooding rainfall that could produce maybe 3 and in some places 4 inches of rain. And once again, a relatively short period of time. So we'll have to watch some of the same areas that have all of that saturated ground where, again, the water cannot absorb into the ground. So it goes up, producing that flash flood concern. I mentioned nicer weather on the way. It is already across the Midwestern states, moving to the Great Lakes states. Temperatures in Chicago today will only be at 75 degrees. Meanwhile, we have showers and storms across the northern tier states back into the Great Basin. Nice and dry weather back into California. Meanwhile, excessive heat across the deep south back into the southern plains. Texas, Dallas specifically, high temperatures today around 107 degrees. Tomorrow, 103. Those triple-digit temperatures continue all week long. In fact, cooling to 101 degrees by Friday. Vlad, I know you're a fan of the heat, but after a long summer like this, it's getting hot out there, isn't it?
Ooh, boy. You know what, though, Grant? I know it says 100 degrees back there all 5 days or whatever, but I'd still rather have that than, like, anything below freezing. So, you know what? No apologies. Thanks,
Hang
my
on
brother.
to it while you can. Winter's coming.
Exactly.
Yep.
Winter is coming, my brother. Thank you very much. We'll check in with you before the end of the show. All right. Ukrainian troops have captured nearly 400 square miles in Russia's Kursk region, and for the first time, Ukraine's president is relaying exactly what the goal of his military's offensive is there. We're going to tell you. We'll be right back. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. At least one person is dead and 6 others are missing after a yacht sank off the coast of Italy. The Coast Guard says 2 Americans are among the missing. Crews already rescued 15 passengers and continue to look for the rest of the group. Officials say the yacht encountered bad weather before sinking. We're going to keep you up to date on this story as we get more details. Meanwhile, for the first time since its surprise incursion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is clearly stating the goal of the offensive in the Kursk region of Russia. He says it's to create a buffer to help to fend off any future attacks by Russians across the border. Almost 2 weeks into the offensive, Ukraine says it has captured nearly 400 square miles in the region. CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee has the very latest from Ukraine. Ian, good morning.
Hi, Vlad. Overall, this incursion into Russia has been very successful. First off, Ukraine surprised everyone with this offensive that pitted elite troops against poorly trained Russians. But as the fighting rages on, the Ukrainians are utilizing speed, aggression, and maneuverability to take more territory in the Kursk region. Kyiv is also able to destroy key bridges, which is making it more difficult for the Kremlin to reinforce their troops. Now, we traveled just several miles from the border and saw a steady stream of military vehicles moving in and out of Russia. I spoke with some nearby residents, and they said they're glad to see the Russians finally feeling what it's like to have the war come to their doorstep. Now, the plan, we heard it last night from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He laid it out, saying the objectives are to destroy Moscow's fighting capabilities and to create a buffer zone on Russian territory. Ukrainian officials believe they could make even more gains, and they have the weapons. The only problem is that the most effective ones are supplied by the West, which forbids them from being used on Russian territory. Vlad?
All right, Ian, thank you very much. Have you heard of August's blue moon? It's an extremely rare event. We're going to tell you all about it and where to see it illuminate the skies. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Got some breaking news coming into the newsroom. You're looking at a scene out of Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where police say there was a shooting in a courthouse parking lot. A suspect is on the run and at large, and multiple agencies are trying to find that individual. Police say there are 3 victims. We do have some live pictures coming into us. We're going to stay on top of the story. We'll follow it. And as we learn more, you'll know more about it right here at CBS News 24/7. All right, let's talk about this now. Hundreds, if not thousands of people pass a farm in Rochester, Minnesota every day on Highway 52. But 100 years ago, it wasn't only a family farm, it was also a prolific Prohibition-era distillery. CBS News Minnesota reporter Barrett Leone has more.
These 2 buildings have been here a long time.
Brian Frandrup is a bit of a historian, and growing up on this sesquicentennial farm, there's a lot of history to discover.
Has been here in the family since 1866.
Like these moonshine jugs.
They're over 100 years old for sure.
Seen in this photo of his great-grandmother.
And she's pouring the moonshine out, and it could have been one of these jugs.
Or this inscription behind a farm shed from his great-uncle.
Columbus, Friarmouth, June 21st, 1923. It's been here ever since.
But what's really piqued his interest in recent years,
many of my relatives have it hanging up in their homes,
is this photo.
Federal officers asked them to pose for it.
Recognize it?
You know, they could never have imagined how long this photo would have survived and been circulated.
It was taken during a federal raid on their moonshine operation, August 14th, 1924. Susie and Florence Friarmouth posed for the photo, rifles in hand.
Their father was the moonshine king of Dakota County,
making Brian their great-nephew. See the resemblance?
We assume they were arrested shortly after this photo was taken.
Yep. One of many arrests. Yeah.
It wasn't their first or last run-in with the law, but certainly the most iconic.
Moonshining here, moonshining there.
The photo was printed in newspapers across the country and even Canada.
Yeah, we got caught, but, you know, we're going to keep doing it, and they did.
100 years later,
you know, we have that history to talk about.
The family farm looks a little different, but its part in history will stand the test of time.
Prohibition was such a transformative time in America's history, and this farm was at the center of it.
Near Hampton, Barrett Leone, WCCO News.
All right, let's bring back CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the last look at the national forecast. Grant.
Hey, Vlad, we haven't talked about Ernesto all morning long. Ernesto still strengthening back to a Category 1 hurricane after dropping down to a tropical storm over the weekend. 90-mile-per-hour winds right now, but still a good 500 miles off the U.S. East Coast. This thing races away from us, but still producing hazardous rough surf and rip current concerns all up along the northeast coast as we go through the next couple of days. Meanwhile, heavy rain and flooding rains expected across the northeast again today. Nicer weather across the Midwestern states with very hot weather on the way for Dallas. Vlad, back to you.
All right, Grant, thanks very much. We'll see you tomorrow, brother. And don't forget to look up at the skies tonight because a rare blue supermoon will appear bigger and brighter than most full moons when it appears this week, NASA says. The moon will be visible through early Wednesday morning. So stop, take it all in, folks. Meanwhile, an encore of CBS Mornings is coming up next. This is CBS News 24/7.